Hi once again, guys. We are back on the stage for the last time today. And on the other side of the screen, on the other side of the wire, and in the other side of the world is Talia Nassi. Hi, Talia.
Hi, thank you for having me.
It's nice to have you here. I know you just woke up. Where are you connecting from?
I'm coming from Los Angeles.
Yeah, it's early morning, right?
It is. It's
Yeah,
pretty early.
yeah, and it's getting dark in Vilnius. So Um, the Earth doesn't mean anything anymore. The
Yeah,
planet is flat,
time
let's say,
doesn't
at
matter
this moment.
anymore.
Yeah. Okay, so a few words about Talia before she begin her talk. So Talia Nassi is a developer advocate at Split.io. She works with engineering teams globally to ship software more efficiently. She is passionate about feature flagging, canary launches, testing in production, and A/B testing. She'll talk about production and testing in production. I know she used to travel a lot giving talks like this. So it's really a pleasure to have her here. So Talia, stage is yours. Good luck, and let's hear from you.
Thank you. So, yeah, like Lucas said, one of my passions is testing and production. So that's what we're gonna go through today. So, I'm Talia. I'm a developer advocate at Split. And basically, I used to be a test engineer. I used to work in QA and automation and did all things testing for a while before I joined Split. Um, and being a test engineer is really hard because most of the times you have a staging environment, and most companies use a staging environment to test. But I always had so many problems with my staging environments because they weren't the same as production, and I would test things in staging and it wouldn't be the same as production. So I'm assuming that if you guys use a staging environment, that it's not an exact replica of production, right? Because there's so many issues that this leads to. And these are some of the problems that I dealt with my staging environment that I think can resonate with you all as well. So the first thing is the data in staging does not match production, which means the test results don't always match. So I used to work so hard on testing every product requirement. I used to go through the documentation with the product owner, and I would work with the developers to fix all the bugs, like make sure everything's working in staging, make sure my end-to-end tests are passing, and then I would sign off on the feature. And then as soon as it's launched to production, there would be a bug or there would be something happening in production that we didn't see or that we couldn't see in staging. And it's such a horrible feeling as an engineer when there's all this pressure on you to make sure that your feature works in this dummy environment. So that was really stressful for me that I was forced to test in this place that wasn't. The other problem that we had with data was configuration drift. So configuration drift is this idea is that let's say that you get paged one night because there's a problem for your mobile application. There's an incident. And you look at the logs and you figure out what the problem is, you identify it. In order to fix it, you have to update a specific configuration in production. So you make the change in production and you go back to sleep because it's like in the middle of the night. And even though you fixed the issue, you just created an even bigger divide between your staging environment and production because you didn't make the same change in your staging environment. And many times, staging environments are not the same as production because of changes made during incident management. And this is what's called configuration drift. And then I thought, what's the point of testing and staging if it's not going to give me the same results as production? Like this is not it's not okay. And then the other thing is that staging is also really slow. So there's very bad performance in staging. And when I used to write automation tests, I used to write end-to-end tests. You would have to add in like waits and sleeps because things take longer to load, but that's not how your users are going to interact with your features. So I'm not going to like in staging, I would have to add, wait for 10 seconds for this button to appear and then click on the button and then wait another 10 seconds for this thing to appear. Like your users are not going to wait 10 seconds for things to appear and 10 seconds for things to load. Like why make that part of your test, Um, And nobody cares if staging is down. So I would be assigned to test these like hot fix tickets, which were critical bug fixes that needed to be immediately released to production because there would be like something happening. So I would log into staging to test it, but staging is down. So you ping the DevOps guy, but he tells me they're doing performance testing and staging, and another team is using staging right now. So I have to wait until that's done. And then I try logging in again, but this time I get the 404 screen of death. So I ping the IT guy again, and he says that I need to get this ticket escalated by my manager, but she's at lunch, so I have to ping someone else. Like, there's always like a huge process with getting staging up and running again. And all I was trying to do was test this high priority ticket, but nobody seemed to care, right? So no one's going to get a call in the middle of Thanksgiving dinner if staging is down. Like, nobody cares. And I was so fed up with dealing with this shitty staging environment and being blamed for when things didn't work in production. And as a test engineer, you're constantly looked at as the gatekeeper for features being released, right? And I thought there has to be a better way. Like, there has to be something else that we can do, because my users are not going to log into staging to use my application. They're going to log in to production. So I did a ton of homework and I researched like, what are other companies doing? And this is what I learned. So firstly, it's the norm for companies to use staging environments, especially companies that are still waterfall. So this is just like the standard of like what companies do is they use staging. And then most companies have more than one staging environment. So I've worked at companies that have like one staging environment per day. So like staging 1, staging 2, all the way to staging. Companies that have like staging and pre-prod and beta. So they use those different environments for different types of testing. And then I also learned that big name companies like Google and Facebook and Netflix and Twitter, they all test in production. And I thought, test in production, like, what is that? How is that possible? Testing in production means testing your features in the environment that your features will live in and not using a dummy environment like staging or QA or test. And I thought, wow, this is perfect. My end users are not going to log into staging, they're going to log into production. So this solves that problem. I also learned that testing in prod doesn't mean you only test in prod. So you still use staging for like GDPR and SOX related like data and privacy issues. And I thought, like, this is great because I can test what needs to be tested in prod. And if it can't be tested in prod because of like legal or data or something, some other reason, then I can just use staging for it. And then I looked into the how, like, I want to start doing this. How do I do this? And the answer was feature flags. And feature flags are a way to separate code deployment from feature release. And the idea is that you deploy your code to production behind a feature flag, and then you test it in production, and then you release the feature with a click of a button as soon as it's bug free. And this is kind of how I picture the process, and this is a reflection of what it looks like in the UI. So basically what happens is your developers create a feature flag from the UI and then target all of your internal teammates. So when you target your internal teammates, this is similar to dog fooding where you test the feature with only the people who are targeted. So dev, QA, product, design. So anything related to the feature can only be seen by the users that are inside of the feature flag because the default for the flag is off right now. You can see the toggle is to the left. And the people who are on the right, these end users, they can't see anything related to the feature because they're not targeted. They don't know what's going on. So it's good because while the feature flag is off, you go in and you test everything. You test your functionality, you test your design, you go through all the requirements, you just make sure that everything works in this time. And if you do happen to find a bug, it has no impact on your end users because they don't have access to it. They're not targeted in your flag. So just in case something goes wrong, like these people on the right, like they don't see anything wrong. And then once you know that your feature is working, you turn on the flag already knowing 100% that your features are working in production and you didn't break anything that was existing. And now your users are happy and they're dancing because they have a perfect feature and you didn't release any bugs. And I thought, this is wonderful. This is such a great process, but how do you automate it? Because you can't possibly manually test every feature every time you release. And with feature flags and the added stress of testing in production, you have this added complexity, you have this added sensitivity. So how do you automate it, right? So there's two options that you have for automating this process. The first one is that you can target your test users and automate the flows with them. So every time automation bot A logs in, they will have access to the feature regardless because they are on the whitelist of that feature flag. So if you target your test users inside of the feature flags, the only problem is that you'll have increased fragility. So like if someone goes into your feature flag and removes that user, the test will start failing. So this is good to get started, but I wouldn't recommend this for like a long-term approach. What I would recommend is overriding your feature flags, and you do this by making a custom feature flag abstraction. So in practice, for each feature, you would have 3 tests. So in the first test, you simulate the feature flag on. And for this test duration, if you get any requests asking if the feature flag is on, so like from the test, then you say yes. And then in the second test, you simulate the feature flag off. And if you get any requests coming in from the test asking if the feature flag is on, you say no. And then in the last test, you want to validate that you can get through the entire flow regardless of if the flag is on or off. So with this approach, you're explicit in the test, and the test becomes much more self-documenting and descriptive. So whenever any test runs in a system under test using feature flags, the system under test is going to fake out all the variants of the experiment. And because it's fake, you reduce the complexity of the different scenarios, which means faster tests. So basically what you're doing is you're declaratively setting the state of a flag for the duration of the test. And then when you run these tests in production, you want to make sure that your tests only interact with other testing entities in production. So what you do is you have a back-end flagging system in production, and you would have some sort of Boolean that differentiates your test data from your real data. So in this case, I'm saying the test objects have this data attribute of is test equals true, and then the real objects have this attribute of is test equals false. So the tests are looking for these specific elements with these specific test attributes in production. And if the test doesn't find it, it fails and you get alerted. So I'm going to log in with this test user, click on this test thing, perform this action with this test object. And if at any point you don't find the test object in the test, you're not going to click on the real object. The test is just going to fail. And you do this differentiation with you can do it with ARIA labels or some other data attributes, but this is great because you can differentiate in like Looker or Datadog, differentiate real data from production data, because you can say everything with is test equals true is going to be over here, and everything with is test equals false is going to be on this side. And this is where product and the business people and all of my stakeholders are going to see like all of the real flows in production and what the real users are doing. But for testing purposes, you know, the QA team is going to have access to this other database with like all of this other test data. But of course, there are exceptions. So if your software is integrated with a third party, something that you can do is you can create a header into the third party and say, hey, any request that you get with this header is a test, and I want you to treat it in this other way. So just work with the third party and give them some sort of information that they could use to differentiate on their side as well. Also, like email confirmations, if like at the end of your flow you get an email confirmation and you don't want that email to send for a test in production, like maybe you have to send that email somewhere else if it's coming from a test. So you're going to have to make some sort of exception sometimes for your tests and prod, but that's just the way it is, because you're testing like a real user would. And then if you're testing a chain migration, you want to be sure that you don't lose any data, right? That's the most important part of a database migration. So the safe and recommended way to do this is to wrap your feature flag around the elements of your code base, not your database, because if there's a problem with your code and you need to revert, or if you decide you don't want to update the schema anymore, then all you would need to do is change the code that's behind the feature flag without touching the database code. And then once the feature flag is deactivated, you could do a separate migration that'll just drop that column or add that column or whatever you wanted to do, right? So the way I like to think about this is like, let's say you're on a frozen lake. You're standing in front of a frozen lake and you're not sure if it's stable enough to hold you while you walk on it. So you stretch out your right leg, you gently apply pressure, and then slowly move your left leg to meet your right leg. And you do this continuously to build your confidence until you reach the other end of the lake. But if, however, you feel the ice crack underneath your leg, you would slowly revert your actions and go back. So this idea is called the expand contract pattern. And just as you need different versions of your software to work at the same time, you also need different versions of the database to work at the same time. Because when you're rolling out a change, in reality, you can't stop the world, update your code, and then start the world again, right? You have to do it gradually, which means more than one version is going to have to work at a time with the database. So when you're migrating to a new database schema, you expand the schema to work with the old version and the new version, and then contracts to only work with the new. And this allows the gradual rollout of the new changes to be successful while knowing that the old code still works for your users who haven't gotten it yet. And so for this process to be effective, each change on its own should be backward compatible so that just in case you have to roll back, your database is still going to be valid. And when you're doing database migrations in production with feature flags, you're giving yourself this added layer of risk mitigation in case, quote unquote, the ice cracks and you don't end up making the change, or if the change doesn't work the way you expected in production, you have this extra layer of risk mitigation. And then besides feature flags, there are some other dependencies that you need. So the first is an automation framework. Like I said, it's not scalable to test everything manually. So I'll give you some recommendations for an automation framework that I really like on the next slide. But again, you don't want to test everything manually. So I like automation frameworks that are easy to adopt and easy to debug, one that has really good reporting. So when a test fails, you look at the test and you know exactly what's happening. And then you also need a job scheduler that will run your tests for you. So you can run tests in your build pipeline. You can run tests on a schedule, either like through a cron job. It can be like nightly. It can be daily at the same time. You can customize that depending on the tests that are most important for your product and your team. And then it's also really important to have an alerting tool, right? What's a test without an alert if it fails? So you need an alerting tool that will alert you every time a test fails. So once it fails, you get alerted and you figure out what's going on. So these are the recommended tools for testing in production. So for feature flagging, I recommend Split. My absolute favorite automation framework is Robot Framework. It's an automation framework from Helsinki, and they just built this amazing framework that has like a keyword-driven library. Like they're not paying me to say this, I just really like this automation framework. And then Cypress I've also used for JavaScript applications. For your job scheduler, I don't have a preference between Jenkins and Circle CI, Travis, Maven. For alerting, you can use PagerDuty for like your more aggressive alerts, like something is failing, you have to go look at it right now and figure out what's going on. And then you can use Slack for like your test updates or like your general like everything passed, everything's good type of stuff. But you can configure that. And I went through this whole process and it made total sense to me. But if it's so simple and you downloaded all the right tools and you're using feature flags to test in production, if it's so simple, why isn't everyone testing in production? Like, why do staging environments still exist if you have this process that solves all of your problems? And the answer is that people are scared. Companies and people don't test in production because of this fear and this lack of trust in their systems. And for the same reason, they refuse to invest in the tools and the process changes that will generate that trust, right? They're too afraid of the risks. And there's a few things you can do to mitigate the risks of testing in prod. So the first is, like I said, use feature flags before you launch. So you target your internal teammates, test with them, and then turn the feature flag on, already knowing that your feature works and you didn't break anything that was existing. So with feature flags, you're really able to create this bubble, and the only people who will be able to see that feature are the people who are inside of this bubble. So if you haven't used feature flags before, go to split.io. You can create a free developer account and start using feature flags. The next thing is a canary release. So a canary release is a percentage rollout. And what this is it allows you to release your feature to a small subset of users before you release it to your entire user base. So if something does go wrong, would you want 100% of your users to encounter the issue or 1%? So let's say you do use feature flags and you do test in production and everything works in production, but you release to production and it just so happens that there was like some small configuration that you didn't test and something breaks. You wouldn't want your entire user base to be affected by this. So I really recommend, especially in the beginning, starting out with canary releases, just so you can have that gradual rollout in case something does go wrong. And then I also recommend starting with an AA test. So with an AA test, what you do is you give both sets of users in and out of the feature flag the same experience. And so what this does is this allows you to make sure that the data coming in is the same for both parties. So this is going to build your confidence in the feature flagging system. This is going to build your confidence in the feature flagging system. So what you'll see, the data that's coming in from both sides of the AA test, and it'll be coming in the same. And this will build your confidence and say, like, even though I haven't used feature flags before, I can see that it is working. The other thing you want to do is start small, right? You don't want to start out with like the most complex flow that you have and decide to test that in production, right? You want to start with something simple. Start with like a CTA change or a button change. You don't want to take your most complex flow and say, hey, I want to start out with testing this in production. It's a good idea to start small and then grow the complexity as you get more comfortable with testing in prod. And then the outcome of testing in production was that we were able to release faster because we weren't tied to a specific release night. So the great part about using feature flags as part of your feature release is that with the click of a button, you can release a feature, right? And this is really kind of pivotal for agile companies, because with waterfall companies, with companies that don't release quickly, you don't really have a choice but to gather all of your new code and ritualistically release at one time, right? But with feature flags, you can deploy your code to production behind a feature flag, test it internally with your team, and then release the feature when it's ready, right? So not only will you be able to release faster, but you'll be able to release much more frequently. And then you also have increased developer velocity. So your developers spend more time creating new features and less time fixing bugs, because there aren't as many bugs because you catch them in the testing cycle and not when your users have not when your users have seen the bug, right? Like as an engineer, like it's such a horrible feeling when I test something and I test it really well and then I release it and then there's a bug, right? So this process really helps to increase our team happiness, which increased our engineering culture, right? So I don't want to wait until something breaks, have a user report it to me, and then fix it. Like I want to know what's going on. I want to know if something's broken. I want to be able to fix it before anyone ever sees anything wrong, right? I want to be proactive as opposed to reactive. And that's something that testing in production gives you, is this proactiveness when you're testing. You also have an increased confidence when you're releasing, because you already know that your features are working in the environment that they will live in, not a dummy environment. And if I haven't convinced you that this is a good idea, I want everyone to think of the last feature that your team deployed. Just take a second and think about, like, what was this thing that your team deployed last? Is it working right now in production? How do you know? Your users haven't reported anything to you, like your alarms haven't gone off, like you haven't been paged. So you assume that it works, right? But you don't actually know. Testing in production is the only way to know that your features are working right now in production. I know that it does require this culture shift, because a lot of times when you mention testing in production, you get this like head turn of like, what did you just say? Like, what do you mean? What's testing in prod? Like, how do you do it? So a lot of times it requires this culture shift. And shifting your company's testing culture is often like the hardest part of the entire testing in prod process. Like getting over this fear that I talked about, getting over this initial fear is really important. So what I would say is use examples from your past. So talk to your team and think, like, is your staging environment unreliable? I can tell you for a fact, like, yes, your staging environment is unreliable. If you have multiple staging environments, is there a way to condense them into one? Think about like those things when you're talking about testing in prod. And then again, start using feature flags if you haven't already. Go to split.io, hit create a free developer account. We have a ton of SDKs available for you to use. But if you haven't used feature flags, they're kind of like the magic potion when you're testing. So, all right. So in case you have not been paying attention at all for the past 26 minutes, I want you to take away two things from this talk. The first is that nobody cares if your feature is working in staging. We care if it works in production, and the only way to know if it's working in production is to test it in production. I also just want to mention that we are hiring. So if you go to split.io/careers, you'll find some positions. And that's all I have. So this is my Twitter and my email address. In case you guys have questions, you can tweet me or email me or tell me what you think about testing in production. I think I'm going to take some questions now.
Yes, Talia, can you hear me? I'm back to you.
Yes.
Yeah, so thank you, Talia. Thank you for the presentation. We even enjoyed the little barking by your dog. Very reserved and nice barking. Yes, so such a low voice wasn't even bothering us at all. So yeah, we have some questions, and for those who are still watching, you can still write these questions. We will answer those. Let me begin the first one. Lucas Piazza was asking, could you share the slides? Could you, I guess, he wants you to send. Yeah, so I guess, Lucas, can you write to Talia? Maybe it would be easier way to do it on email.
Yeah, if you email me, I will send you a copy of the slides. You can also, I have an account on Speaker Deck, so if you just Google Talia Nassi Speaker Deck, you'll see my slides there.
Okay, so that's one of the ways, or otherwise you can write Talia. You can see her email. Okay. The questions are coming here. So Ignas Yoroshunas was asking, what about smoke testing? And I asked him to elaborate on the question. And he just wrote that it's preliminary testing to reveal simple failures severe enough to, for example, reject a prospective software release.
Yeah. So you can still run smoke tests. You can still run smoke tests in your build pipeline in production. But the most important part of that is to make sure that they're blocking. So you want to make sure that they run in production against the branch that you're trying to merge. And if any test fails, you want to make sure that the push doesn't go through and that it's blocked.
Great. So if Ignace, if you want to follow up, you can write the question. Let's move on. Vladislav is asking, Talia, maybe you have some experience about testing database code in prod. Did it work like usual by your slides?
Yeah, it did. So obviously, like the first time you do something, you're gonna make mistakes. So that's why I always say like start small. But when you wrap your feature flag around the elements of your feature flag and not your database, you're really you have that extra layer of risk mitigation. And like I talked about the expand contract pattern, you really need two versions of your software to work at the same time. And so I go into a lot of detail about a blog post that I wrote on database migrations with feature flags. It's on the Split blog. But yeah.
Okay, let's move on. Aurelius is asking, are there any tools to automate the activation of feature flag on errors or anomalies detected?
Yes, so you can automatically turn off a feature flag if there's something going wrong in production. So the way it works in Split is if you can set up your feature flag to correlate metrics with specific flags, and then say like if these metrics go down, like immediately turn off the flag. And then you can do it in another way too, like if your metrics are going up, you can increase the percentage allocation of a flag automatically as well.
Okay, I'm trying to read all the questions because there are quite many, and the chat is moving. So Tim has a question, but Tim, could you say what do you mean by asking? I imagine this requires elevated rights or authorization for developers. Did you experience problems with that in waterfall-oriented company structures?
Did I have problems with implementing testing in prod?
With that, so yeah, what is this and what is that? Tim, could you write the question again so we know what is this and what is that? Because yeah, we are too late to answer the question. The talk moved. So okay, let's move to Caro. Caro is asking, should we ditch staging completely?
No. Okay, so like I said, you can still use staging for like GDPR and SOX compliance, like the flows that like legal just won't let you test in prod. That's like your backup, like for the things that you absolutely cannot test in production because data issues, privacy issues, whatever it is, like you can still use staging for that.
Okay, still reading the chat. Rita is saying, thank you for a great presentation, a very relatable topic. And Marcin is saying that it's a good hint about AA testing. It's really a great feeling to learn about your A/B testing after a long time doing them. So that's cool. Justina has just found the slides. That's good. Thanks a lot for the presentation, Gabi, Lucas, and Tim. The question was, okay, I'll try again to formulate the question that Tim had. So he asked, he said, I imagine this requires elevated rights or authorization for developers. Did you experience problems with that in waterfall-oriented company structures? He says he's talking in terms of the DevOps teams and company culture.
Yeah, so this happens when your engineers don't have access to production. So when your engineers and your developers like don't have access to production, like it gets hard. Like how do you test in production? So the first step I would say is figure out like why you don't have access to prod and if that's something that you can fix. But I would work with like your team and just make sure you can say like, I need access to production because I want to test this thing. You're obviously not going to get it like overnight. It's a process. But if you're having these issues with your staging environment, like chances are you're not the only person who's experiencing like this pain. So just work with your team and just have this conversation with them. Like if they've never used feature flags, like try it out in your next sprint. Like figure out if that's something that your team wants to do.
Thank you. Thanks, Talia. So, Tim, thank you for the question. It's my bad that I didn't understand it in the first place. So thank you. Thanks a lot. And thank you all for the questions. If you have any more questions, we still have time to answer those. Vita is also saying thanks, thank you. So a lot of people, it looks like they enjoyed the questions, and we still have 7 minutes left. So if anyone has anything to share, Tim says perfect, thanks. So good to hear. If anyone has anything to share, anything to ask more about testing and what Talia talked about, so you can still write in the chat. I can see it right away. And but it looks like the questions are about more questions. Okay, great. I love questions. So Ruta is asking, in your personal experience, how much manual testing is still needed in production after test automation?
Okay, so with each flow, I would say you still should test with the feature flag on and with the feature flag off manually one time, just to make sure, like, if there's any bugs, like that they should be caught manually first. So let's say I'm deploying a feature, my team's deploying it, and it's going to be put into the builds pipeline, but first I need to test it manually. So it's going to come in, the developers are like, okay, it's ready to be tested. I'm going to go in and I'm going to test this in production manually. I'm just going to go through the steps. If I find something wrong, I'm going to open a bug, and I'm not going to automate it yet because the tests are going to fail if I automate it. So if I find something wrong, I'm going to push it back to the developers and say, hey, this is something that's wrong. Can you please fix it? They'll push it back to me. I'll test it manually again. Once I know that it works, then I'll write the automation test and then check in the automation test at the same time that I check in the code for the actual functionality. So the PR for the actual functionality and the PR for the test can be merged at the same time. And what that means is that the test is always running when the feature is on for 100% of the users.
Thank you, Talia. And Ruta is also saying thank you for a great presentation. So,
thank you.
Ruta, thanks for the question. If you have any more, please, we still have some time. So, great questions, Talia. And meanwhile, we are waiting for questions. Maybe someone has some, maybe no. People are not disconnecting. So let's continue a little bit more. We have still about 90 people in the room. So, Talia, it's still early morning after the presentation. Are you going back to sleep? Do you have this? Can you afford that?
I don't know. I think I just need to have some coffee.
Okay. Yeah, you deserve that.
My morning coffee.
A big cup of coffee. Have you ever been to Build Stuff?
No, I haven't. I was supposed to go. Supposed to come this year, but it didn't happen because of Corona. Hopefully next year, the world will be back to normal, and
yeah, that's what we are all hoping for. Even though if you came here, you would need a few cups of coffee because of the time difference, I guess.
Yeah.
It's got completely dark here outside my window in Vilnius. So I guess that's kind of all. A lot of thank yous going your way. So thank you, Talia. Great presentation. Good to have you here, and hopefully we can meet in Vilnius next year.
Yes. So thank you so much.